Hello, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. I'm really excited to be here to talk about this really important topic of occupational heat stress and some of the technology solutions that are out there to help safeguard our workers. My name is Kenna Stanley. I am a Senior Research Associate with the National Safety Council's Work to Zero initiative. And we are really excited to be partnering with the American Industrial Hygiene Association on a three-part series on occupational heat stress and the use of wearable technology. In these three parts, we hope that you can take back some nuggets of information on both this really high-risk topic as well as some of the solutions that you could perhaps use in your own organizations. We have a packed full agenda today, so I'm going to dive right into the content. If you have any questions throughout the duration of this webinar, you can leave them in the Q&A section. The chat section should also be on, so if you want to communicate with your fellow attendees, feel free to do so in the chat section. And if you are interested in learning more about the use of wearables, particularly vital signs monitoring for heat stress, Work to Zero does have a paper released on this topic where you can learn a little bit more about some of the things that we'll talk about today, including some more tailored heat stress mitigation strategies that you can use in your organizations. And as a reminder, this is webinar number 1 of a 3-part webinar series. So you are here at number 1, where we're going to talk about the risks and some practical strategies you can take for heat stress mitigation. Next Monday, July 14th, we will talk about some common barriers to wearable sensors for heat stress mitigation. So we'll talk about some of the legal challenges, HIPAA considerations, how to build employee engagement, and work on your safety culture to then make technology integration a little bit easier. And then on the third webinar, we will talk about some specific use cases of how employers are actually using wearable sensors for heat stress mitigation and to safeguard their employees in the workplace. With that being said, I will turn it over to our first speaker. We have Dr. Maggie Morrissey Basler joining us, who will set up this topic of occupational heat stress. Maggie, I will turn it over to you, and hopefully you can remote control on your end.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction. Hi, everyone. As mentioned, Maggie Morrissey Basler. I'm an assistant professor at Providence College, also the senior occupational advisor of occupational safety at the Corey Stringer Institute, and also the former chair of the Thermal Stress Working Group at AIHA, and have worked with many different companies to improve their heat stress management plans. And within 15 minutes today, to start us off, I'm going to talk about heat stress and its impacts and risks. See if I can, here we go. Perfect. And so hopefully not a big surprise to everyone on this call is that heat events are continuously getting worse every single year. It seems like every summer is worse than the last. And you can see in the figure on the left side that heat wave frequency, duration, season, and intensity increased from the 1960s all the way to the 2020s. And the UN had an emissions gap report that they published, and what essentially it was saying here is that the current emissions are projected to go up to 2.8 degrees Celsius by 2100, which is problematic because that far exceeds the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold that is critical to have climate impacts. And so what the really unfortunate thing is that at this point, there remains no credible path to get us below that threshold. So whether anyone likes it or not, heat is here and it's going to continuously get worse. And so the UN actually had a call to action on extreme heat, with a particular call saying that we need to protect vulnerable populations, and workers being one of them. And so to give you some context about how many workers are affected is globally, it's about 2.4 billion workers. So it's about 70% of the working population. And these are individuals exposed to heat. And so Globally, again, it's about 22.8 million non-fatal injuries with about 19,000 deaths annually, and that's reported. And at this point, the rate of occupational injuries and deaths associated with heat are increasing, and it's with no change to rates of overall occupational injuries and fatalities. So we're seeing that in particularly with heat, we're getting more and more injuries and deaths. And I want to point out is a lot of times people think that this only occurs during heat waves. But in fact, a lot of the heat related injuries and illnesses and fatalities actually happen outside of a heat wave. And so this is where the figure here from the ILO shares that 9 out of 10 worker exposures occur outside of the heat wave, and 9 out of 10 occupational injuries are linked to outside of heat wave. And so when we're working in the heat, what's actually happening in the body? And so I want to make it clear that heat exposure is not just environmental heat load. It is environmental heat load in combination with physical exertion as well as PPE. So as you perform physically exerting work, you generate more metabolic heat that heats up your body. And also personal protective gear can essentially impair your ability to dissipate or lose the heat and cool your body. And so when we have exposure to these types of heat exposure, we have increases in core temperature, increases in skin temperature, heart rate, sweating. And these are actually totally normal responses. This is our body essentially trying to ensure that we're maintaining homeostasis or normal function. However, it's when we get into the excessive heat exposure or insufficient rest breaks, inadequate rehydration, inadequate nutrition that we can get into risk of exertional heat illnesses, which include heat syncope, heat exhaustion, and then the medical emergency, which is exertional heat stroke. And so bringing you back to this figures describing the global impact of heat, if you look at the right-hand corner, it has regions that have the most rapidly increasing heat-related occupational injuries. And since we're in the United States, the Americas are actually increasing by 33%. This is heat related. But when we look at OSHA reported data, sometimes it's a little bit puzzling to people because they say, well, there's only about 3,400 heat related injuries that happen in the US. So is heat really that impactful? And so what I want to tell individuals when they mention that is that heat exposure causes so much more than heat illnesses. So bringing you back to the figure I presented with heat exposure causing these initial physiological responses. But however, when we have this continued excessive heat exposure, lack of rest, it can not only cause risk of exertional heat illnesses, but can increase fatigue, cognitive, neurological impairment. That can cause increase of accidents, can also have increases in cardiovascular strain that can increase risk of cardiac events, especially in those with underlying risk factors for cardiovascular disease. And I'll talk a little bit about this momentarily, but there's also an increase of acute kidney injury. And over time, acute kidney injury can result in chronic kidney disease of occupational origin. And not only do we have these health and safety effects, but we also have productivity losses. And the unfortunate thing about when we talk about occupational heat stress is that unlike athletes, you can't have an adjusted training load or, you're only training during one day. Workers have to come back day in and day out for prolonged hours. And so really there's this lack of recovery that accelerates this cycle of exposure and therefore can further increase risks of these heat related problems. And so again, I want to mention that heat related injuries are underreported, right? So when we saw that OSHA data, it seemed low, and that's because there's a lot of events or conditions that are caused by heat, but not necessarily a heat illness per se. And so to give you some context about the impact is that a study in California looked at worker compensation claims and evaluated whether they are heat related or not, and found that there was actually a 20,000 additional heat related workplace injuries that were not accounted for. And if that's extrapolated to the entire United States, it's about 170,000 additional heat related injuries. And so that would put it about number 3 of workplace injuries. Oops, sorry about that. And so again, it's because, yes, heat causes heat illnesses, but it also causes cognitive, neurological impairment, cardiac, and kidney injury and disease. And a lot of times, again, why it's being so underreported is because OSHA records the proximal cause, right? So if it's a cardiac event, it's going to be logged as a cardiac event. It's not going to say that heat caused that cardiac event. Also, a lot of heat-related illness treatment is classified as first aid. So water and ice is typically the treatment method, and therefore does not need to be reported. There's also a very large undocumented workforce. Again, oftentimes not injuries, illnesses are not reported. And then we tend to have poor surveillance, which impairs our ability to ensure we're accounting for the amount of heat-related injuries and illnesses that occur. And so I do want to mention chronic kidney disease of non-traditional etiology and occupational origin because it's very prevalent in the entire globe. And many people don't think that it happens in the United States, but it really does. And what it does is essentially it's the combination you see on the left side of physical work, exertional heat load, dehydration, causing elevated core temperature. And we call this hypovolemia. Essentially, that means having very low, essentially, volume of blood. And combination of exposure to environmental agents causes this acute kidney injury. And so when we have this repeated exposure of acute kidney injury, that's what leads to chronic kidney disease. And it's very prevalent in the construction, agriculture, mining. And the really difficult part about it is that it is not present with any traditional cardiovascular disease risk factors. And unfortunately, it often happens without any clinical symptoms. So once the clinical symptoms actually present themselves, it tends to be too late. This person already has this chronic kidney disease. So I want to bring some awareness to this, and this can really be mitigated with cooling, with prevention strategies, as well as hydration. And so I also want to mention that heat stress impacts productivity as well. And so specifically, I'm going to talk about labor productivity, although there are non-labor factors such as reductions in agriculture yield, mechanical failures, infrastructure failures, all caused by heat. But heat impacts both absenteeism and presenteeism. So absenteeism is essentially bringing workers away from the job because they have an injury, illness. And presenteeism is essentially reduction of work that's happening on the job site itself. So heat can cause increase in lost salaries and wages. You also have to find workers to replace those that are on leave. So you have to hire and train new staff. There's also healthcare costs for treatment and rehab and increases in cost per compensable claim. And then on the job site itself, heat can increase lost work time. It can reduce the physical work capacity, so the ability to do your job. But not only that, it can cause a reduction in the quality of work, again, because of that cognitive, neurological impairment. And so to put this into numbers, if we're talking about the economic burden of heat, may not be the budgets right now in the United States for these departments, but the United States could lose on average about $100 billion annually from heat-induced lost labor productivity. And to put this in perspective, in 2021, the Department of Homeland Security's annual budget was 21.7 billion, and the Department of Housing and Urban Development an annual budget was 44.1. So essentially, what the United States is losing from heat-related productivity is both of these budgets combined, and it's going to continuously get worse and double to nearly 200 billion by 2030. And so in summary, heat exposure negatively affects safety, health, and productivity. And so productivity effects include reductions in physical work capacity, lost work time, reductions in quality of work. But there's also acute and chronic health and safety issues such as heat illness, cardiac events, chronic kidney disease, and neurological and cognitive impairments that cause increase in accidents. And so in the last couple of minutes that I have, I do want to mention that there are a lot of risk factors for heat illness. And this goes beyond just environmental heat exposure, the physical exertion, but individual risk factors include poor nutritional intake, taking certain medications, dehydration, obesity, hypertension, diabetes. Poor fitness level is a massive risk factor. When someone's has a higher fitness level, we tend to say that they are partially heat acclimatized because they are able to tolerate heat better. Also, individuals who are of older age, pregnant and nursing women, or people living in poverty may have increased risk factors. So there's some workers that are at higher risk than others. And I also want to mention that some jobs have higher risks than others. So, and this is what I like to when I talk to different companies, I really like to take an industry approach because the physical exertion, the amount of environmental heat load is very, very different, as well as the logistical nature of the work is very different across different industries. So we need to make sure that when we develop these heat-related plans, that they are specific to that industry. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, my email is on the slide here, as well as X and LinkedIn. And I will pass it over to Kenna.
Thanks so much, Maggie. There was actually one quick question that, if I may, just so we have you on. What is the definition of a heat wave?
Yeah, so I think heat wave is, I'm not sure the exact temperature threshold, but it tends to be at a certain environmental ambient temperature threshold. And this is typically determined by federal agencies, and there's typically an announcement that a heat wave is either present or there's a heat advisory to ensure that individuals are taking extra precautions. So it's very based on ambient temperature.
Thank you so much for all of that great information. I see another question. Will the slides be shared? Yes, we will have this posted to our YouTube channel. That will take probably about a week from now, but that will be shared out for everyone. So if you don't get to anything, it will be posted there. At this point, I would like to turn it over to Larry Sloan, who will talk a little bit about AIHA and the fantastic heat stress app that they have out. Larry?
Great. Hello, everybody. It's really an honor to be here, and AIHA is very appreciative of partnering with the National Safety Council on this webinar. Looks like there's a little bit of a glitch. We are going to be talking about the AIHA heat stress app. So I've got a few slides here. Let me make sure that let me get to my mouse. Okay. So I want to thank Maggie and all the work that she has done on behalf of AIHA. She was one of the lead volunteers on a task force that was developed a couple years ago that created the heat stress app that we're going to talk about today. And the reason that AIHA embarked upon this project in the first place is, again, Trends in global climate are only getting worse with every passing year, and we recognize that physical hazards such as heat stress are a significant impact on worker health literally around the world. And so I'm going to cover some slides very quickly. You'll get copies of these, and I'm not going to have time to do a live demonstration of the app, but if you have any questions, please feel free to email me directly following this webinar. So we obviously know the impact of heat. Maggie did a great job of explaining that in her remarks. Heat stress, which is what this app is going to measure, are the external conditions. Maggie talked quite eloquently about heat strain, which is the impact on the worker themselves. And so as she explained, there are a lot of underlying health conditions that can only worsen the body's response to heat stress. We're all familiar with wet bulb lobe temperature, the WBGT index. It is a combination of multiple factors, as noted on this slide: the ambient air temperature, the relative humidity, the air movement or velocity, and radiating heat from, for example, an oven or a boiler or other types of equipment. We know that the preferred environmental heat metric to measure heat-related illness is the WBGT. There have been studies that have been conducted over the last several years. And we know, again, based on those four components that I mentioned earlier, there are 3 types of thermometers, and this is the calculation for the WBGT. So you can see 7/10 of the value of the wet bulb temperature, 2/10 for the globe temperature, and 1/10 for the dry bulb. Now, the algorithm that powers this app was developed by our friends down at East Carolina University. And so when AIHA embarked upon this project, we wanted to make sure that we had a robust algorithm that would power the calculation of the heat stress. And so we're very pleased by the partnership between AIHA, East Carolina University, and the app developer that we are using has worked with the university over the last many years on other projects. And so it's been a wonderful trilateral relationship between the app developer, our academic partner, and AIHA, and its volunteer base. So version 1 of the app was released last summer, 2024. And again, it was a proposal by the AIHA Thermal Stress Working Group, which is open to anybody. So if anybody on this call would like to get involved in the workings of that working group, please let us know and we'll get you signed up. I mentioned the partnership between East Carolina University and the app developer is a company called Dual Boot Partners. This is a reference tool that does not carry any regulatory authority, but it is based on a lot of the studies that have been conducted on behalf of OSHA and CDC, NIOSH over the last many years. It is a free app that's compatible both with the Apple and the Android devices. We wanted to make sure that there were no annoying pop-up ads. And we decided when we created the app last year that we wanted to make it available in the 4 most commonly spoken languages in the Western Hemisphere. It is being used globally. We have deployed it literally around the world. And, if there are any technical glitches in terms of accessibility, we want to make sure that we hear about them so that we can resolve the issue very quickly. Now, people always ask, does it interface with specific physiological monitors? Does it collect data? No. We made a conscious attempt to make sure that we would simplify the approach. If we were to interface it with monitors, that would certainly add to the complexity of it. We didn't want to add any personal data collection because that would then require access to specific servers. And so, again, this is strictly a tool that measures the environmental heat stress and what the impact is on the worker. It's not a replacement for any of the apps that are currently available. Many of you may be familiar with the OSHA NIOSH heat safety tool. That is still out there in the marketplace. And we wanted to make sure that it was really designed for the layperson. A lot of the IHs that were involved in the development of the tool wanted to add all sorts of complexity to it. And we said, let's keep this tool as simple as possible. So it's designed for the employers and even for the employee, for the worker. And as I'll get into in the next few slides, we provide quick reads on related topics, some of which Maggie covered in her remarks. It calculates what's called the adjusted WBGT, and then it calculates basically a color-coded heat stress risk level based on US military color code. And then it provides first the federal regulatory guidance, which quite frankly is not the most practical. And then there are a series of strategies based on the increasing degree of heat stress. And I'll get into that. Version 2 of the app was just released in early May, so just a couple months back. And the additional functionality on version 2 is not just for the outdoor worker, which was version 1, but for the if you will, the non-HVAC environment worker in the indoor environment. So if you're in an indoor environment and you don't have air conditioning where you work, say in a manufacturing facility or in a warehouse, this app is now designed for both the outdoor worker as well as the indoor worker. So here's the QR code. I'm going to stop here for just a few seconds. If you wanted to take your smart device and wanted to aim it at the QR code, that will take you to the landing page on the AIHA website. And on that page, there's additional information about the app, and then there are links to both the Apple and the Android app stores if you want to download it. Conversely, on your phone, you can go to your app store directly, and you can type in AIHA heat stress, and it will then direct you to the appropriate page on the App Store to download it to your device. Okay. So the app functionalities from version 1, which again from last year were relegated to just the outdoor worker, are the following. You input a location. Now, one of the great things that we've developed over the last couple of years is that we've made the sensitivity of the location much more specific. So you can input your city or state. You can input a street address because we recognize that there are parts of the world, for example, out in California, you have a lot of microclimates. So you might be at the beach and the climate will be a specific temperature and humidity. You go 5 miles or 10 miles or 15 miles inland and the climate is completely different. So we've enhanced the functionality of the app so that you can really literally identify and specify a particular address in identifying the National Weather Service data that's being pulled into the app. You answer a question about your workload intensity, whether it's low, medium, or high. You answer a question about the type of clothing that you're wearing. And then if you're using the app for an outdoor worker environment, you're asked to identify the relative cloud cover where you're working. If you want to identify the hours of day that you are working, you can indicate a heat alert. So basically you can, let's say you're working, 6 a.m. to 3 p.m. Monday through Friday. It will then send you heat alerts if you're in a high heat stress environment during those hours of the day. And then we've made various enhancements to the app that I'm not going to get into right now, but we wanted to make the app as flexible as possible and to give the employer the amplitude to basically input as many locations as they want. So maybe you're managing teams of workers in multiple locations around the city, or you're managing groups of workers literally around the world. You can add as many locations as you want and monitor the heat stress in those locations in real time. In version 2 that was just released a couple months ago, we now add the indoor heat monitoring capability. And you can manually input the temperature and humidity and even the wind velocity in an indoor environment, or you can select a differential from what's pulling from the National Weather Service outside, and you can have a delta of 1, 5, 10 degrees, if you will, between the outside environment and the indoor environment. It also accounts for what we call non-solar radiating heat sources, such as an oven or a boiler. You can save your default settings so that you don't have to manually add them to your other locations. And then it also allows what's called a forecasting modularity. So for example, it will tell you what the WBGT will be in the future, later on in the day, for example, and it will give you the heat stress health recommendations based on those conditions in the future. So you can plan ahead. I talked about the notifications. There's now an offline mode so that if you are no longer connected to Wi-Fi or cell service where your workers are located, it will let you know that you're in an offline mode. And so that's a wrap up of the app. If anybody has any questions, again, I don't know if we have any time, but I can answer them now, or you can drop me a line at lsloan@aij.org. We're very excited to continue to deploy the app and to collect feedback on it. And again, if you have any questions about its functionality, please let us know.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Larry. I do have one question here for you. Will the app work outside of the US, considering some countries don't give heat alerts?
Yes, the app has been designed to work literally around the world, and you can type in your city and state or a more specific address. It doesn't matter what country you're in. We have tested the app in all of the continents except for Antarctica. And so if there's a national or a regional weather service in that area, it'll pull that live weather data into the app for you automatically.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Larry. And I will say I have the app on my phone. It's a fantastic resource. So definitely recommend it if you do not have it. Really breaks down heat stress in ways that are very accessible for employees. So appreciate that, Larry. I'm going to take my control back of the screen here. Really quickly, I wanted to kind of level set and talk about what we're talking about when we talk about heat stress wearables. In just a moment, I'm going to pass it over to Rob Summers, who is doing some really fantastic work at Perigo, both in their heat stress program and with some heat stress monitoring wearables. But really quickly, I wanted to kind of define wearables so that we're all on the same page. So when we're talking about wearable technologies, these are typically body-worn devices that can monitor different conditions, gather that data, and help respond to heat stress. So there's kind of three main buckets of data that can be collected through wearables. The first is environmental. So these wearables are just collecting information about the environment itself. So things like the air temperature, we could see the radiant heat. So that is heat that is being let off by any equipment nearby. We can look at humidity levels, pressure, light or sun exposure. So these wearables are collecting data about the environment, but not necessarily the worker themselves. There's also wearables that can collect information about physical strain. So while it's not quite breaching into looking at biometric data, we can collect data around where workers are, how much physical effort they're putting in, if they have prolonged periods of exertion. And a lot of these wearables are also equipped with motion detectors. So oftentimes they can sense if a worker is down or if they experience a fall, a slip or a trip or something like that. And then there are physiological monitors. I think a lot of times when we hear about wearables, these are what we initially think of. And these wearables, similar to like an Apple Watch or a Garmin smartwatch, can actually look at worker biometric data. So we start to look at some of the indicators of heat stress through these wearables. That can be things like an increase in your skin temperature, changes in heart rate, changes in blood pressure, if a person's respiration rate increases, if we see a increase or a decrease in fluid loss. So important to mention that wearables can collect one or more of these different buckets of data. So, you know, there can be some pushback when it comes to collecting worker health data. So important to mention that some of these wearables can just collect information about the environment and not necessarily go that extra step into biometric data if that's going to be a problem. There are a lot of benefits of wearables. We will talk through some of the benefits today, and then on our next webinar, we're going to talk through a lot of the different considerations that are also included in with this technology. But typically what we see with wearables is one of the biggest benefits is real-time monitoring, right? So you have continuous monitoring. And because they are on the worker's body, it really lets us account for some of those individual differences in location, in how used to heat somebody is, in how much physical effort they're putting in. So we can account for some of those individual factors that Maggie had mentioned that can make someone more or less prone to heat-related illnesses. They provide proactive alerts. So oftentimes, if a worker is either in high-risk conditions or if their body is experiencing or showing symptoms of heat-related illnesses or injuries, it can actually proactively alert them to then, you know, go into the shade, get some rest, drink some water, and recover before they continue their work. These alerts can also be sent to their supervisor or to management as well. The data can be huge. Rob is going to talk a little bit about how they're using this fantastic data to help kind of inform their heat stress policies and programs. And it can also be really great for worker education. I saw a question come through regarding how we get employees to take care of themselves at home, because obviously lifestyle factors play a lot into how tolerant a person is and how well they will perform in high heat environments. So what we hear oftentimes is with these wearables, it can be a really cool way, sort of biofeedback mechanism for workers to see how their lifestyle can impact their performance. An example I like to use is over the weekend, a lot of people may have an alcoholic beverage or two that can dehydrate a person. So if they can see those, different effects maybe during the work week and kind of see how things like sleep, their nutrition, their hydration can impact their own performance. And last but not least, I will mention that there are different types of wearables as well. As I mentioned, body worn is going to be the ones that we typically think of. These can be wrist watches, they can go in the arms, they can be strapped to the chest. I have an example here of in-ear heat stress monitors. So these are attached to the body. There are also clip-on monitors. These are most likely going to be your environmental monitors, but they do have some wearable heat stress monitors or WBGT meters if you're interested. Mobile apps, again, cannot be underestimated. Larry just gave a great example of AIHA's app. But there are also other companies that can work with pre-existing wearables like Apple Watches or smartwatches that can integrate into those watches so you don't have to get new hardware. And then also emerging is smart PPE. So definitely keep an eye out on these new technologies emerging. There are some great movements in being able to monitor workers in their PPE so that we don't have to adorn them with an extra wearable and kind of keep them comfortable, keep them safe during the workday. So definitely keep an eye out there. And with that being said, here are some considerations for adoption. Just make sure you're selecting technology that meets your needs. You want to make sure it's meeting your needs, not the other way around. Determine which type of data you need. Do you want to collect environmental data? Are you interested in the amount of physical strain your workers are going through? Or are you interested in, as we said, some of that physiological data? Engage early and often. Make sure you are transparent, you're communicating with your workers. And start small and pilot up. And we have Rob here who will talk through some of the fantastic things that Perigo is doing kind of with both wearables and with their heat stress program. So at this point, Rob, I am going to give you remote control here, and I will pass it over to you for the duration of the webinar.
Thanks, Kenna. Okay. We'll see if it moves here. Okay. So I work for Perigo. We're a pharmaceutical consumer products company. And I'll tell you quickly a little bit about them. Most of our products are private label, store brand kind of products, and we do have some branded products. I have to do these obligatory slides, but I'm going to be focused on indoor heat. So I'll talk more about that. But our products, when you go into the following retailers and globally, there's a number of retailers internationally too. These are kind of the product portfolio. We operate in over 80 countries. So I'll jump into the heat stress program. And this webinar, I'm going to focus primarily on the program and touch a little bit on the wearables, and then not the next one, but the one after that, the third webinar, I'll go into more detail on the technology and how we've incorporated it in. So we have 3 manufacturing facilities. They're infant formula nutrition facilities. So we liquefy and dry that to make infant formula. And that liquefied material, obviously, in a dryer, creates very high temperature environments for people to work in. There are people in these dryer towers routinely throughout the day, and depending on how well the operation runs, they can be there more doing other more manual labor over just the monitoring and keeping up with the process. but infant formula manufacturing, indoor environments, what I'm going to focus on. So probably back in 2017, 2016 is when we really implemented our first comprehensive program. For a number of years, we were doing pieces and parts of what OSHA always tells you about, rest and liquids and or outdoors, having shade. But you need to be able to rest somewhere. You need to have a cooler area, for those breaks, and you need to take in fluids. That's the foundational aspects for any heat stress program, no matter where you work, indoor or outdoor. And obviously outdoors, that cool and shade, is a challenge for you. So how do you keep up with it? That was, one of our biggest things is, how do we keep up with the temperature and what we need to do based on that temperature. So how long can they work, and how long should they rest? Acclimatization, excuse me. I still think acclimatization is probably one of the biggest black boxes in the heat stress program for most people that are trying to deal with it. There isn't a simple way of saying, being able to identify that person's acclimatized now. They've worked in the environment for a week or 2 weeks, they're acclimatized. So, I think that's something that, is a challenge that we always will have to address and figure out, is when that person gets acclimatized. And, I think other people have touched on, temperature, humidity, heat index, wet bulb globe temperature, dry bulb. There's lots of ways, but you have to have data at the end of the day to understand, what your risks are. So we use wet bulb, and we also use, the dry bulb, but you need to understand your risk. You need to understand what the temperatures are, so you know what to do. And you need to be able to monitor that, whatever environment you're in. We developed a permit to work, really taking into account, we wear uniforms, we wear Tyveks sometimes, and depending on the situation, we may have an additional layer. So you could have 1, 2, or 3 layers of clothing, depending on the work that you're doing. So, really our permit to work process, when you reach a certain temperature, then, that work rest ratio and all those things come into play. And then the activity that you're going to do, that metabolic work rate. What are you going to be doing? Are you walking up and down stairs, or are you opening up a line or a piece of equipment because there's a plug or something like that? Those are totally different scenarios. So just understanding the work that's going to be done, understanding your work and how it happens. But our original program, had the basics, core things, and we've gradually added things to it. And then the technology finally caught up to a point that, we could add in, some technology to it. But understanding, again, your temperatures and what you're going to do based on the temperatures, what controls you're going to put in place. I'll talk a little bit about different controls that we have, but understanding what you're going to do when, so that when the time comes, you hit that temperature, you hit that scenario, you know what to do, and your employees know what to do. Making sure you communicate to everybody so they understand that. Buddy system, 2 people work over, lone worker scenarios. Do you have to wear cooling vests, electrolytes, having those available where you can get to them, and a dryer tower because of, it's a FDA regulated environment. We have controls or zoning, and you can't just leave a zone to go get water or liquids easily without changing your clothing. So, we make it complicated. Just the work environment makes it complicated. You always talk about make it easy to do the right thing, and that's somewhat challenging sometimes when you're an FDA or some other regulated environment where it requires you to wear certain PPE or certain protections, from quality standpoints. You have to account for all those kinds of things. Acclimatization, you heard me before. This is, this is our scenario of what we do and how we expose them to the heat. and for how long. But I will tell you that this is probably still the most complicated piece of our program, tracking people and understanding how you expose people to heat based on the work that they're going to do, or training new associates coming in and how you do that. So this is one of the more challenging pieces. Would love to come up with a more concrete way of doing this, some biological parameters or things like that. Working with Maggie on some of those ideas, she talked earlier, it'd be great to be able to come up with something where you can tell based on the biological data, is that person acclimatized? So our program, manual, this is really converting over, and I'll show some photos later, towards digital and TVs and kind of, I'll call it an indoor weather forecast. But our original program was just on boards, your daily meetings, managing for daily improvement, tier meetings. We talk about those things and what we're seeing and what are the conditions. Our permit process, making the stuff available. Our tools, we have cooling vest, we have ice packs, we have, cooling rooms on a number of the floors of the dryer tower. We've added those in. We never had those. All of our, PLC kind of control rooms now have turned into these cooling rooms where people can take their rest and break and take in fluids. It's also where we keep the cooling vest if they have to change the activity that they're going to do, or if that temperature changes and goes up. The wearable devices that we use and wear, will also dictate some of those things and, help us manage that. So we've set up cooling rooms in a number of floors within the dryer tower so that they can do that. Again, we didn't have those previously, and we've implemented that at all of our locations. Well, most of our locations. Cooling vests were a big challenge. We make food, infant formula, and from a quality perspective, the toxicity of the gel that's in there was a big sticking point. And we finally found a non-toxic gel that's inside the cooling vest, and we were able to get our quality group and other people to buy into allowing us to do this. We found a surgical vest that surgeons wear when doing surgery. So we had to find a special vest that would meet the requirements, and it's also launderable. But we've done a number of things outside of that, engineering controls, capital projects to put in spot cooling and to change the humidification within the dryer tower. So we did a number of things just for the heat stress program, not just for product related things. So we made a concerted effort to try and improve the environment because people were in that environment somewhat frequently. We've added air intakes. We have cooling stations. You could turn these on and off. So we actually, you leave it off until you're going to do work in that specific area. If you had to do something specific, you can turn these on and off, and they're directional so that you could blow cool air in the direction and actually cool down the area that you're working in a little bit. Obviously, when you're in a dryer tower that's 130 plus degrees, it's still difficult, but these cooling areas and zoned areas have been very helpful. Just again, additional engineering controls that we put in place, building cooling rooms, in these areas so that we can take those breaks. Let me jump ahead here. So we've, like everybody else, we've had these traditional elements of our program. And I will tell you that the one thing that was missing was technology. It was very dependent on people, the permits, monitoring. We've integrated in technology now into our program, and it was the game changer. It was the final piece. Even with all these things, we were still having people that would have different levels of heat stress. Throughout the summer when you have those high heat days, we were still having incidents that were happening. So by adding the technology in, we were able to get past some of that. And I'll knock on wood, we have not had a significant incident since we implemented the technology. So for us, it's done what we wanted it to do. We're using Slate Safety, not promoting Slate Safety over anybody else, but we're using Slate Safety, both the wearable devices, and then also there are Bluetooth devices that we're monitoring temperature, and we've correlated that to our wet bulb globe temperature that we take side by side. So we have Bluetooth temperature monitoring throughout the facility too, in the areas that they work. Our initial pilot was back in 2022. And we started off with the devices, have a charging area outside, our locker rooms, and everybody checks out their device that they're going to wear for today. Everybody has their own individual bands, and you can monitor them, on the software. The 4 things we're focused on is the core body temperature, level of exertion, the heart rate, and then there's with these 4 parameters, they give us alerts, and these are configurable, and you can change these to whatever you see fit, obviously working with a professional to help you. And as Maggie highlighted, these are great, but at the end of the day, individual personal factors do influence us significantly. Your health status and disease state and level of fitness, all those things come into play, and you can see that when you start looking at data. We've integrated into our EHS software system also, so we have automatic alerts. As I said in the next webinar, the third webinar, I'll go into details about all the different things that we're doing, but we've integrated all the notifications into our EHS software system, so we can identify what is it that we did when that person had an alert. Did they take a break? Did they go to the cooling room? Did they take in fluids? What was the scenario, so that we can kind of track and understand if specific individuals or areas are having higher frequency events, so that we can look at it. So we've integrated this in, and we have a Power BI dashboard, data warehouse associated with all this data. So we are looking at it, seeing what we can learn from that data. But that's one of the things we've added in, is adding it to our EHS software system. So the alert happens from Slate Safety's device and automatically sends an alert. Supervisor, manager, everybody gets alerts from the Slate Safety system, but also they get this in their email. This is, I mentioned dashboards. The dashboards from the software we have on TVs in specific areas and all the cooling rooms, also in the the daily meetings that we have these dashboards. It's kind of a weather report where it indicates the temperature and, are we in a permit to work, temperature range. And then also you can see, what's happening with the Bluetooth devices. What are the temperatures actually in the areas that people are going to work? So you can kind of see, a little more of that. But we've added a number of additional things. I mentioned Corey Stringer Institute and Maggie. I think that has been important to continuous improvement, to look at our program and what do we need to do, evaluate, the alerts and warnings and how we respond, and just being prepared for those scenarios. I can't say enough of having, a knowledgeable professional industrial hygienist, somebody that specializes in this, looking at your program to make sure you don't have gaps in it. So, we implemented our program, and then we reevaluated it, with, that support from a professional. Opportunities, lone worker is still always a big one. We still have people that are, out there by themselves. We've worked with Slate Safety to do other things for us, the wet bulb globe, temperature correlation with the Bluetooth devices, setting up the Bluetooth devices within our facility. It's helped us with a lot of other things. So, those are partnerships. Every one of your vendors, obviously they want to expand their capability. So, they'll be more than willing to work with you to come up with solutions to help you improve your program. And then acclimation, you heard me talk about. That is it. Sorry I went so fast. And as I said, there will be more to come in the third version.
No, that is Excellent. Thank you so much. I always really appreciate having you on, Rob, to talk about the incredible things that you're doing at Perigo to protect your workers. So at this point, we have a couple of minutes for a Q&A. So I will ask both Larry and Maggie if you both could come back online, and we will get to a couple of these questions. So let me see. So the first question I see is, while we have no control over after work for employees, are there any recommendations for employees that don't have AC or a place to cool off after hours?
Yeah, I can jump in here. So I think, yep, it's unfortunate if, employers only have the opportunity to provide protections during the work shift, of course. So I think what I would suggest is I like to use the acronym RESHAPE instead of OSHA's water rest shade. It sort of expands it to RESHAPE to include rest, environmental monitoring, shade, and body cooling. Body cooling is a great opportunity to use if you can, like Rob was suggesting, because especially if you don't have AC, there's a lot of active body cooling modalities you can use. Let's see, hydration, heat acclimatization, procedures and policies. So that would be like your emergency procedure for heat related illnesses. And then the last one, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on what the last E would be, but just some examples of what can do. Fundamentally, the heat protection strategies are similar across industries. It's just different in how you implement it given the logistics of the nature of what you do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Maggie. Let me see. This question is specifically for Rob. Were you able to get management buy-in right away? And did you have any struggles in the early days of the program implementation?
Yeah, so I'll call it part one and part two. Part one, the early days of the program, that 2015, 2016, when we really developed a good written program, we had buy-in, but it's like any safety program. You unfortunately have to have a more significant event occur for people across the board to have the light bulb go off, and we had one of those. And in the next talk, I'll probably touch on it a little bit. But we did have buy-in, but the buy-in changed once we had that event, and we were able to use that. We never were told no. We never had significant resistance. It's just like anything. The level of implementation and buy-in just was never 100%. Everybody was on board. And as soon as we had that event, it made it real for people. And that kind of drove home the point. Everywhere we had that case that we could talk about. This is real. This happens to your coworkers. It's got to be significant enough that it wakes them up. Obviously, fatality really does that. But sending somebody to the hospital and you're a coworker, it kind of wakes you up to, wow, this is real, and I can see that. So, yeah, unfortunately, we had an event that helped drive the awareness, to a new level.
Thanks for sharing that, Rob. I have one more question that I think I will kind of pose for all of you, and then we will wrap it up. But if you have any other questions, please feel free to shoot me over an email and we can absolutely get you some answers. But the next question is related to the proposed OSHA standard. Do you all have any sense about like what you think the future of that standard might be? Do you think it'll go through? You think it'll kind of be paused?
I'll take the lead on this one. My opinion is that there is not going to be a federal standard. I feel pretty pessimistic that there will be. I think that we're going to rely more and more on the states. And you see states like California and Maryland that have their own state heat standard. We're hearing that New York City is going to have its own metropolitan heat standard. I think we're going to have a patchwork of regulations around the country. And I'm down here in New Orleans for the weekend. We have an AIHA board meeting. And I was just having a conversation a few minutes ago with my colleague here, talking about the fact that the heat standards that are being developed, some are based on ambient temperature, some are based on heat index. I haven't seen one based on WBGT yet, but that might come.
Absolutely. It sounds like we're probably all aligned with that. I tend to agree with you, Larry, on that. I want to thank Larry, Maggie, and Rob for being here, sharing your expertise. I really appreciate it. For everyone's knowledge, the second webinar in this series, we're going to talk through some common barriers to wearables. So think things like the legal challenges, compliance questions, how to build worker acceptance, and work on your safety culture to make technology accessible. So please join us for that second webinar. Again, thank you to all of our speakers and thank you for attending. Any questions, please feel free to shoot us over an email. And you all have a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
So.
Thanks.